going to increase racism between the two. So moving on to European imperialism in China. So we're still in Asia, but again, we were talking about, the British are trying to quickly, or more so, they're trying to take control of more raw materials, more natural resources that they're able to manufacture into goods. So a little background on the British and China. So when we get to this time in the 1800s, the British are going to notice that there is an imbalance in trade. The British are importing a lot of goods from China, so they're purchasing a lot of goods from China, but the Chinese aren't purchasing a lot of goods from the British, so they have more imports than exports. If you remember mercantilism, right? You want to have more exports than you do imports. So from the British perspective, this is an imbalance in trade. And so the British are trying to renegotiate their trade agreement with the Chinese. And so we're actually going to look at this in an activity, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but when the British are sent to renegotiate these terms, the Chinese turn the British away or basically deny their request for two things. The British wanted a trading port of their own, so an outpost of their own, which the Chinese said no to. If you remember back in Unit 4, the Chinese had not necessarily isolated themselves, but cracked down on European influence and trade in their country. And so they only had a couple or three trading ports open that the Europeans could come in and out of. And this was more so to not only control Western influence and the Europeans coming in and out of China, but also it was easy for the Chinese to keep control of taxes in these areas as well as the Europeans were coming in, so to tax the goods that were being traded. And so it was much easier for the Chinese to keep control of. So in short, the Chinese say, no, you cannot have your own trading port, because if they would have given the British their own outpost, they would have had to have granted an outpost to other European countries. Other European countries would have started to ask for the same thing. So due to Chinese the Chinese desire to limit Western influence, they said no. Also, the Chinese didn't feel like they needed British resources and British manufactured goods. The Chinese make a comment, something along the lines of basically, we produce everything that we need already. We do not need British goods or more British goods. They're useless to us. We produce everything that we need. So this is going to obviously not only just upset the British and offend them, but also they still haven't, fixed this imbalance in trade. And for the British, one thing that they're purchasing from the Chinese, for example, are things like tea. Tea is in high demand. So there's no way that you can really control that imbalance in trade. So for the British, they're going to have to come up with something that is desirable for the Chinese to purchase. So in this case, they're going to start to sell them opium. So right now we're going to look at how Great Britain's need for resources caused the Opium War. So once the British are denied their trading port, they're also denied, the renegotiation of their trade agreement with China. The Chinese are not going to import more British goods. The British start importing opium because, again, the Chinese don't see, they're not seeing any value in other British goods. And so the British are going to basically give them something that they are interested in, which is opium. And opium comes from India, which we just talked about, British furthering or deepening their control in India. It's officially a British colony. The British have taken control. And opium comes from India. Opium is very addictive, or is a very addictive substance. So since the British couldn't really interest them in other manufactured goods, opium was something that they could bring in that, the Chinese public could get addicted to. And then, of course, the increase in demand is only going to increase in the demand from there. So the Chinese government is going to ask the British to stop. And they're also going to go as far as actually outlawing the selling of opium in China, but this is only going to lead to the British, illegally smuggling in the opium in some cases. So when the British don't stop, the Chinese rebel and they try to stop the trade instead. And this is what leads to the Opium Wars. Unfortunately for the Chinese, they are going to be unsuccessful in trying to defeat the British due to the fact that they cannot match the military technology that the British have, or the technology in warfare that the British have. So the opium trade is going to continue after this. And so after this, the British deepened their control in China because now they've defeated China in a war. And so they create what we call an open door policy. Basically, what this does is it allows a lot of countries to come in and basically establish their own spheres of influence, create their own trading rights in the area. And so, what this looks like is this. So this basically increased the foreign influence in China. So you're seeing these different colors on the map. So you can see these are British spheres of influence. A sphere of influence is an area basically where the British have control in this area. And in this area, even though they're in Chinese territory, it's considered, British land. The British don't have to listen or follow Chinese law in that area. So even if they violate Chinese law, they cannot be punished by the Chinese. They can only, or they only have to adhere to their country's policies. So that's what the sphere of influence is. So basically, this is British territory now. So they have the right to control and trade in that area. So the orange is the British, the yellow is France. Japan's got a little bit as well. Germany, you'll see, is also there. Russia has a little bit as well. So you're seeing or you're increasingly seeing more European countries, and even in some cases, Asian countries as well, taking control and taking advantage of this opportunity to actually establish a sphere of influence in China. So this is going to lead to the exploitation of Chinese resources. So these countries control different areas in China. Basically, these spheres of influence allow them to live and trade under their own laws, not China's, which again, violation of Chinese law, and there's really nothing that the Chinese can do about it. So for the Chinese, especially the Chinese public, they're going to be increasingly upset or grow increasingly upset, more and more upset about this. So while this leads to the creation of markets for the Europeans to sell their goods, they're exploiting the natural resources and they're exploiting the Chinese. So finally, in 1900, this exploitation in these spheres of influence comes to a head with the Boxer Rebellion. And the Boxer Rebellion is a rebellion against European influence or Western influence and imperialism in China. The Chinese do not want this open door policy there. They don't want to allow these other countries to just come in and establish these spheres of influence in China. And so this rebellion is led by these boxers, these skilled fighters, who form basically the secret society, and they lead the Boxer Rebellion. This leads to a 2-month siege, and eventually the Chinese are unfortunately again defeated. And this is due to the fact that because there are so many other European countries and other countries like Japan now have spheres of influence there, when the Boxers start to retaliate, what they're fighting are British forces, French forces, German forces, Russian forces. Also, they're fighting Indians. So the British are going to even bring in some of the foreign militaries that they have formed as well to fight in the Boxer Rebellion. So they're fighting a much larger force than the Chinese are fighting a much larger force than they actually had to kind of counteract that. So, and the U.S. it's going to join in on this as well. So this is a political cartoon. I have asked here, do you think this is American or Chinese? Obviously, it is an American political cartoon, and you can see here, Uncle Sam waving the flag. The flag is one of the only things that has color here in the picture. But it's kind of glorifying, the U.S. and the British fighting together against these boxers who are depicted as uncivilized. You can see they have heads on pikes here, and you can see just the way that their faces and things are depicted. It's kind of making them, again, if we go back to that white man's burden political cartoon, it's depicting them as lesser than or not as civilized as the Americans. They're somewhat barbaric compared to these Western civilizations like the U.S. or more Westernized cultures like the U.S. and Great Britain. Let's go over imperialism in Africa. This is the final portion of the notes. So, looking at Africa, we have been discussing Africa and their interaction with Europe since our unit on the Middle Ages, so Unit 3. So since about the 1400s, the Europeans had actually been trading with and known about and mapping some of what they knew that Africa looked like. So this is not obviously the first time that Africa has come on the scene. So as far as knowing what Africa looks like, a lot of explorers were first who mapped the mountains, the rivers, and the plains. And if you're wondering why it took us so long to kind of get an idea of what Africa looked like, it's because Africa's interior has a lot of rivers that are a lot different from what the Europeans would have been used to. So rivers that have cataracts, rivers that change direction or change flow. And so it would have been really difficult to travel throughout Africa just because of the different types of environment, different types of terrain that the Europeans were not used to. And so we don't really have an idea really at the beginning of this imperial era what it looks like, or this era of imperialism, what the interior of Africa looks like. A lot of people who were first there were explorers and missionaries. So people who are missionaries there to obviously convert those people to slavery. But notice that our two main interests weren't based around slavery. A lot of these people, these explorers and these missionaries, weren't supportive of the slave trade. But finally, as we start to see that there's a lot of valuable natural resources in Africa, a lot of European nations start sending in their military to move in, and obviously these Africans resist. Now, what makes it easier for us to explore these parts of Africa is the mention of like the steamboat. So traveling those rivers that are really violent isn't as hard. But when we get to Africa, it's a little bit more difficult to actually kind of break up and carve up Africa. So let's talk about the Berlin Conference. So if we look at Africa in the 1880s, a lot of these nations are fighting over the territory in Africa, and only about 10% of European countries only control about 10% of Africa. So when we get to 1884 and we have all of these countries competing for control over land in Africa, in order to avoid conflict, because if you remember, this is not that far after Napoleon, and the aim of the Congress of Vienna, back, I think we talked about it in Unit 6, was to make sure that we restored stability to Europe. So in 1884, Otto von Bismarck calls a conference in Berlin, and he says, we got to divide this up, between the nations. We need to do it formally. We need to come to some sort of agreement so we avoid conflict. And so they comes up with this idea for a partition. So partition literally just means to divide. So 14 European nations and the US were invited, but no African nation is invited to this conference, and I'm sure you can guess why. Remember we talked about social Darwinism and this idea of racism, and that the Europeans felt like it was their duty to kind of civilize these areas. So they wouldn't have obviously considered the Africans' opinion in this matter as important. Remember, they thought themselves superior to them. So you'll see this political cartoon again, this political cartoon of the Berlin Conference. You can see Otto von Bismarck here, and they are carving up Africa. And all these other European leaders representing their different nations are waiting to get their piece of the pie or the cake, whatever you would like to call it. You can see the cake is labeled Africa. So he is carving up those pieces so they can divide it up. All right, so we call this time period from like the 1880s to the 1900s the Scramble for Africa. So this is when these European countries are, like we looked at here, they're dividing up Africa, and they are trying to rapidly colonize, because what's happening at the same time of this is, or at the same time as this, is industrialization. So the industrial revolution has really started to take off, and a lot of these European countries are racing to compete for prestige, for power, and in order to fuel your industry, you have to have natural resources. And so for a lot of these countries, this is directly related to their industrial success. They need to colonize, they need to control these areas, And a lot of them also want to expand their territory. So if we look at Africa before the scramble for Africa, before imperialism really sets in there, really we only have a couple of small colonies along the coast. And we said in 1880s, only about 10% of Africa is actually controlled by European countries. And finally, when we get to 1914, we only have two areas, Ethiopia and Liberia, that actually remain independent from European colonization. Okay, so if we're looking at this map, which you might see this again, it's the partition or the dividing up of Africa. So this was what they decide on at the Berlin Conference. You might also, I forgot to mention, you might see this as well. You can see all the different European powers kind of pulling at different parts of Africa, hoping to tear off a peace, right? And this is the agreement that they come to at the Berlin Conference. So you can see the different colors represent different countries. The French obviously get a large chunk, and then we have, the British down here in the southern parts of Africa. So we're going to kind of focus in on that as well. Okay, so over time, because of the increased European presence in Africa, we're going to see that a lot of tribes, just like in other areas, whenever there is an increased foreign presence and whenever there is, imperial power, especially kind of forcing these people, like we saw with like Russification, anytime that culture is forced on people, we're going to see some sort of pushback. And a lot of times with nationalism, we see that it only encourages nationalism. In Africa, before the Europeans had gotten there, there were there were hundreds of different ethnic groups and linguistic groups, so people who spoke different languages, and people who were divided up kind of along those lines. And the Europeans, when they drew the lines of or partitioned Africa, they didn't really take that into consideration. So that's enough of a problem, because they're breaking up certain groups of people, and they're also putting groups of people together that don't necessarily get along. And so because of the European presence in Africa, we're going to see that it increases nationalism, and it increases that, desire to resist European colonization, just like we saw in China, just like we saw in India. The heavier that the presence gets, and the more that they start to take control, the more that's going to cause a rise in nationalism. And so these groups that are being taken over and colonized are going to start to resist. All right, so here's the economic impact for European imperialism in Africa. So before the Europeans got there, a lot of these people were subsistence farmers, meaning that they kind of only grew what they needed to survive, to feed their family. So this is like their only job. They don't necessarily make an income for that. It's really purely for survival. But they make the shift from subsistence farming to growing cash crops. So for Europeans, right, this is important. Again, industrialization, and also growing crops and selling them for income. That all ties in with industrialization and the rapid industrialization that was taking place. And then we also have the creation of plantations and mines. And so what we're seeing really is the exploitation of raw materials and resources and the people. So this is when a lot of the slave labor really starts to take place as well, that we're going to talk about in just a moment. And then European control of markets. So this means that the Europeans basically have economic control of all the resources in Africa as well. Okay, so the political impact is basically that we're replacing these traditional governments that were there before, and they're replacing them with colonial governments. So just like we saw in India, right? They got rid of the traditional Indian governments, and some of these tribal leaders, and like we saw in India, were able to keep power as long as they submitted to European rule. But a lot of tribal leaders are going to lose power. Tribes are going to be split up, like I said, not necessarily along proper ethnic lines. And then there's obviously the competition and the need to resist European control. So 2 examples, we have the Zulu Resistance. This was a tribe in South Africa that actually was almost very successful in resisting the British, but they did eventually, because of the advanced military technology that the British had compared to theirs, they eventually were defeated by the British. And then we also have the Boer Wars in South Africa as well. So when we got to colonization originally in South Africa, the British actually didn't colonize in South Africa first. That was a Dutch outpost. And so Boers were Dutch farmers. So they were kind of descendants of the original Dutch settlers who had been there before. And when the British start to move into South Africa, this forces a lot of the Dutch settlers off of their land. And then when there's a discovery of diamonds and gold in South Africa, that only increases tensions. And of course, the British, the driving force here for the British is to control diamonds and gold, right? Because those things are valuable natural resources. And so this starts a conflict between the British and the Dutch, known as the Boer Wars, in which the British are victorious. And so that's why you see that there's still kind of like a heavy British presence there in South Africa. And the Boers are eventually kind of moved out of that particular area, even though they were there first. Okay, so we're looking at the cultural impact. Very similar to the other impacts we looked at before. Christianity is introduced, languages change because they're phasing out these traditional cultures. They are implementing European or Western education, right? Implementing their own healthcare systems, changing the family structures. And again, this idea of racial supremacy with social Darwinism. So there's like a harsh separation between us and them, and that that white people are superior to the other people who were originally living in that area. And so this is when we start to really see nationalism kind of set into parts of Africa. Now, when we get back to this in Unit 8, when we're going to start talking about decolonization, we'll see that a lot of these African countries actually do earn their independence, but that's not going to take place for a while. So we're going to see the presence, our heavy presence of European colonization in Africa in the next couple units. All right, guys, and that is